Okay, good. Okay, welcome everyone. So here we are, final day of our conference, and it's been for me a wonderful experience. So now it's my great privilege to introduce two more speakers this morning. Both of them will be presenting by Zoom. The first one is Dr. Patrick Laude. He has been teaching at Georgetown University since 1991. In 2006, he joined the faculty of the School of Foreign Service in Qatar, where he teaches courses in religious studies, a former fellow in philosophy at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. He earned a master's degree in comparative philosophy.
Recording in progress.
I hope so. Okay. He earned a master's degree in comparative philosophy from the University of Paris-Sorbonne in 1982 and a doctorate in French literature from Indiana University in 1985. Professor Laude's scholarly interests and output lie in mysticism, comparative mysticism in poetry, and Western representations and interpretations of Asian spiritual and wisdom traditions. He has extensively written and lectured on figures of European spirituality, such as Jean Guyon, Simone Weil, Louis Massignon, Henry Corbin, and Fritjof Schwann. He has authored 12 books and monographs, including most recently, Surrendering to the Self, Ramana Maharshi's Message for the Present in 2002. And there's a lot of other wonderful books he's published and a lot of famous and well-represented articles in the academic field. I won't list them all because of the limitations of time that we have. So that's Dr. Patrick Laude. And now our second speaker, we were going to have three. We were going to have Dr. Carol Zaleski and her husband Philip, but Philip is not able to make it. So Dr. Carol Zaleski is professor of world religions at Smith College. She is the author of several acclaimed books on religion, including Other World Journeys, subtitle Accounts of Near-Death Experience in Medieval and Modern Times, The Life of the World to Come, both of them from Oxford University Press, and co-author with her husband, The Fellowship, The Literary Lives of the Inklings, J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Charles Williams, and Owen Barfield. She also has another book called Prayer, A History, and the Book of Heaven. She's a contributing editor and former columnist for the Christian Century and has published essays and reviews in the New York Times, First Things, America, and on it goes. And then my last remark I want to have is that Dr. Zaleski is celebrated for her writings on the afterlife, which include, in the Encyclopedia Britannica, articles on heaven, hell, and purgatory. Journalist Lisa Miller, who's well known as a journalist of religion, she has called Dr. Zaleski, quote, the mother of modern heaven studies. Okay? So I'm impressed. Anyway, so here we go, and I'm hoping that there's Patrick. Patrick, welcome.
I wish you a good morning. It's here the afternoon, actually the late afternoon, past 4 o'clock. So what follows is a brief meditation on the notion of esotericism or esotericism and its relationship to exoterism. I take the works of René Guénon and Fritjof Schwann as foundational in defining these terms within a perennialist context. I will try to highlight some of the parallels and divergences between these two authors and the implications of these parallels and divergences. And I will try to apply briefly my conclusions to the debated question of the relationship of the esoteric and the sacred law. While René Guénon was the first perennialist to make use of the French words ésotérisme and exotérisme, his way of understanding their relationship was not without ambivalence. In his essay entitled L'ésotérisme de Dante, the Esoterism of Dante, published in 1925, he writes, I quote, true esotericism is something quite different, in French, toute autre chose, from exterior religion. and if it has some relationship with the latter, it can only be insofar as it finds in religious forms a mode of symbolic expression. It matters little, moreover, that these forms are those of such and such a religion, since what is at stake is the essential doctrinal unity which is concealed behind their apparent diversity. This is why the ancient initiates participated indiscriminately in all external worship, following the customs established in the various countries where they were, end of quote. So the context of this excerpt is a discussion of Dante's teachings being expressed both by Christian and ancient pre-Christian symbols. And 4 points seems to me to be noted. First of all, of course, the esoteric or esotericism is radically different for Guénon from the exoteric, and it is even independent of it. Secondly, the esoteric contemplation of the exoteric forms is symbolic. Thirdly, what matters is the one essence and not the formal diversity. And fourthly, the practical applications of the esoteric are simply matters of circumstances. In Rome, do as Romans do, in other words. A second passage from Guénon, however, from his essay entitled Islamic Esotericism, which was actually published a few years before his death, I think in 1947, he died in 1951. And that means about 18 years after his move to Cairo. So this second passage rings quite differently. I quote, "It is a question here of two clearly different domains. That is the esoteric, of course, and the exoteric. And this is why there can never be any contradiction or any real conflict between them. It is moreover obvious that one cannot in any way oppose exoterism and esoterism, since, on the contrary, the second, esoterism, finds its foundation and point of departure in the first. And since they are really no more than the two aspects or the two faces of one and the same doctrine," end of quote. So here again, esotericism is clearly and explicitly distinguished by Guénon from exoterism, but the conclusion that is drawn from this distinction is not the independence and adaptability of esotericism, but rather the absence of conflict between the two. Now, the affirmation that there is no, quote, no real conflict between them hinges, of course, upon the meaning one gives to the adjective real. If one considers, for instance, Mansur al-Hallaj as an eminent representative of an esoteric perspective in the world of Islam, it is difficult to deny that some of his utterances, starting with the famous "Ana al-Haq," I am the truth, were indeed historically in conflict with that of exoteric authorities. Otherwise, he would not have been put to death. Thus, the absence of contradiction can only be perceived from the esoteric point of view, and that's perhaps what Guénon means by real conflict, or inasmuch as the esoteric point of view transcends the duality of form and essence by perceiving everything from the point of view of the essence. So by referring to exoterism as the quote foundation and the quote point of departure of esoterism, Guénon appears to depart from his text on Dante, in which the esoteric was clearly the foundation and the starting point, since the forms were only its expressions a posteriori. Of course, we may speculate that this different position stems from the fact that the second text was written as Guénon, as I said, in the late 1940s, had already immersed himself in the religious ambience of Islam. And if so, one may understand the terms foundation and starting point as referring to the ability of exoterism to provide formal supports that are the methodical first step of the spiritual path. So to write that they, esoterism and exoterism, are, quote, the two aspects or the two faces of the same doctrine is more challenging, however. For in fact, the exoteric pertains to a theological doctrine that is necessarily exclusive of other doctrines, while the esoteric is identified with universal metaphysics by Guénon. One could speak perhaps of two interpretations of the meaning of unity, in Islam, Tawhid, rather than two faces of a same doctrine. At any rate, the key to the ambivalence of Guénon's view of esoterism, or rather the relationship between esoterism and exoterism, is probably to be found in Chuon's distinction between two esoterism in his essay, Two Esoterism. One is relative, according to Chuon, since the esoteric is inherently relative to an exoteric domain or an exoteric mentality. In that sense, there is no inner without outer, and no outer without inner. The second esoterism, however, is, quote, absolute and identified with reality, reality with a capital R, of course, here, reality as such. This, quote unquote, absolute esoterism has no counterpart since it is the essence of everything and since it encompasses everything. Chuon distinguishes, therefore, between an intrinsic reality, I quote, intrinsic reality of esoterism, and another one that is, as it were, accidental. Further on in the same essay, Chuon states, I quote, Advaita Vedanta is unquestionably an intrinsic esotericism, end of quote, but he adds that it, Advaita Vedanta, quotes, suffices unto itself, and it is not an esotericism complement, of course, of an exoterism. We see here that the notion of esoterism, when deprived of its relativity, takes on an altogether different meaning, so that it would be in a way advantageous to replace it by other words such as perhaps gnosis or perhaps Sophia, as illustrated by the fact that Advaita Vedanta is not considered as esoteric, technically speaking, in the context of Hindu traditions. Be that as it may, Chuon's understanding of esoterism takes us away from the relative implications of the term and takes on a precise meaning independently of the latter. It conserves, however, its connotations of inwardness, as implied by the prefix, the Greek prefix. And here is one of the richest definitions, actually, of esotericism to be found in Chuon's works in this respect. I quote, "Esotericism is what lays bare either the relativity of an apparent absoluteness or the absoluteness of an apparent relativity. Seen from very high, the absoluteness of a given form reveals its limits, whereas the existential contingency of a given phenomenon reveals, on the contrary, its essential absoluteness, so that a same sacred element, after having lost the formally absolute character that the exoteric perspective attributes to it, put on, as it were, another absoluteness, or rather reveals it, that is to say, the one of the archetype that it manifests," end of quote. So first of all, esotericism lays bare, quote unquote. So there is a removing or an undoing of forms, and consequently, the making manifest of something that was hidden by them. Then, the relativity of an apparent absoluteness. This means something that appears absolute while it is not, obviously. And religion, in a way, reveals such relativity by opposing a worldly absolutization of this world and highlighting the primacy of a higher reality. In that sense, religion's aim is to reveal that the relative is not absolute. But in doing so, religion absolutizes, in a way, the realities that enable it to lay bare the limitations and pitfalls of the world. It tends to absolutize, therefore, the means or vehicles of the absolute. A distinction between means and goal is practically impossible in religion, because religion, as René Guénon puts it himself, is concerned with the sphere and fate of the individual, including its sentimental components, therefore with the sacred means that are indispensable mediations in view of salvation. It is therefore virtually impossible to dissociate, for instance, Islam from God, at least practically or religiously. In a way, esotericism, as understood by Chuon, is a response to this conflation of means and goal, forms and essence, one that amounts to an absolutization of the relative, or the promotion of an apparent absoluteness. Here, apparent absoluteness does not refer, of course, to the lure of the forms of worldly appearances, but rather to the formally absolute character that the exoteric perspective assigns to religious forms. I've just quoted Chuon here. The formally absolute character that the exoteric perspective assigns to religious forms. And this is, of course, very important. The aspect of appearance does not lie with the sacred forms themselves, but with the way in which they are contemplated. Now, to go back to the relative notion of esotericism, one of the ways in which the polarity esoteric-exoteric manifests is quite evidently in the distinction between the formal law and the inner spirit. It is in this context that the distinction between the two raises the question of knowing whether esotericism is antinomian or antinomian. The term antinomian, developed in a Christian context, refers to an emphasis on divine grace, seen as freeing oneself from legal or even moral obligations. In our context, it would be probably more appropriate to use the adjective enomion to specify simply that the esoteric is in some way independent from the realm of the law, without being necessarily opposed to it. At any rate, one could answer the question of knowing whether esotericism is antinomian in 4 different ways. No, yes, yes and no, and neither yes nor no, following the Indian logical tetralemma or catuskoti. No, no, because it must manifest in a sacred framework, the formal elements of which serve as supports for spiritual work. That is what Schuon would call sometimes the continuity between the exoteric and the esoteric. The second being like a prolongation of the first, or a deepening of the first. And in this respect, it could be said that the exoteric is a symbolizer, while the esoteric is the symbolized. And they are the 2 sides in that sense of the same reality. It's why, for example, Titus Burkhardt in his book on Sufism, on Islamic esotericism, makes the point that the common believer participates in the realities of in the transcendent realities, which are the object of gnosis, in a symbolic manner, or in an as it were symbolic manner, to quote Burkhardt. So if the exoteric and the esoteric are like the symbolizer and the symbolized, then it could be one could conceive of them as the 2 sides of the same reality. And this corresponds perhaps to the second of Guénon's definition that I mentioned earlier. Second possible answer, yes, indeed, esotericism can be and has been antinomian, because it is aware of the relativity of forms. In Guénon's terms, this means that, from this point of view, esotericism is altogether different from religion. Tout autre chose. This difference and transcendence cannot but manifest itself in some ways and in some context. Religion entails an exoteric understanding of forms that tends to absolutize them, as I said earlier, whereas esotericism tends to highlight the provisional aspect of the exoteric. Thus, for instance, Louis Massignon, the great French Islamicist, although not an esoterist himself, could state, I quote, "It is only in appearance and very provisionally that institutions such as sacraments and religious orders establish an authentic continuity, reserving us an access to the marvels of divine grace here below." End of quote. Third possible answer, yes and no, because while being aware of the relativity of forms, esotericism is also aware of their absoluteness, or rather, to use Schuon's felicitously paradoxical expression, their relatively absolute character. The key terms here are probably interiorization and essentialization. And I borrow, of course, these 2 terms from Schuon's lexicon. The first, interiorization, refers to an inner assimilation of the forms, not qua forms, but qua means of access to spiritual awakening. Similarly, essentialization means looking at the forms in terms of their greater or lesser centrality or essentiality with respect to the goal. In other words, some forms are more intelectively and operatively meaningful than others. This can be illustrated For instance, by the prophetic tradition, the hadith in Islam, in which, in response to a question about the surest way to save one's soul in the face of the complexity of the prescriptions of the law, of the divine law in Islam, the Prophet declared, "Let your tongue be always busy with the invocation of God." In the text we have quoted earlier, Chuon makes the point that the laying bare is only possible from very high. And the highest elevation is, from his point of view, that, of course, of the intellect, the divine light within us, which can objectify the forms virtually or actually, which can see them for what they are, that is, in terms of their archetypal reality. In this regard, meaningfulness and effectiveness must be determined in relation to the end of religion. The Sheikh Ahmed al-Alawi expressed this point of view when he taught, quote, "All the practices of the religion have only one goal, which is the remembrance of God," end of quote. There is a continuum, in other words, between the form as such and its archetype, which is in a way the intention behind the form. In other words, the form is contemplated, again, not qua form, not as form, but qua means of access to its essence, which is inner, which means that it can be interiorized and essentialized as the context and as the various needs may require. Fourth possible answer, neither yes nor no, because the object of esotericism, which is also, and first of all, its subject, since the ultimate goal of esotericism, from Chuon's point of view, is self-realization, or the realization of the self, lies beyond all dualities, all oppositions, all contrast. And here the very distinction between an exoteric and an esoteric becomes meaningless. This is the point of view of non-dual or non-dualistic metaphysics, which explains, or is one of the reasons why, Advaita Vedanta is generally not referred to as esoteric, since the latter, or inasmuch as the latter implies an exoteric counterpart. One may object, of course, that this applies to all differences, and one might recall, for example, Eckhart's remark about the fly and the angel. No, the fly in God is much more elevated than the angel in himself, and everything is equal in God, and everything is God. So from that ultimate point of view, of this ultimate point of view, of course, can be applied to everything. However, inasmuch as esotericism is identified as it is by Chuon and others to non-dual metaphysics, and inasmuch as the object and the subject of metaphysics is reality itself, this response, that is neither yes nor no, applies more meaningfully to the distinction between exoterism and esoterism. This is, if one wishes, the metaphysical end of esoterism in both senses of the word end. Now, the inability, whether essential or accidental, to contemplate these four different points of view conjointly is inherent, in a way, to the exoteric outlook, or to perspectives that are determined by an exoteric mentality. Therefore, by what Chuon would call subjective limitations, which are themselves determined by context and experiences. By contrast, quote, esotericism, by its interpretations, its revelations, and its interiorizing and essentializing operations, tends to realize pure and direct objectivity. This is the reason for its existence, end of quote. Esotericism for Schuon is both interiorizing subjectively and essentializing objectively. The more inner it is, as it were, the freer it is from forms, including, of course, one's own psychic forms. And the more it is participating in the essence, hence being objective. Of course, it is not possible to draw absolute boundaries in this respect, since everything here is a question, again, of subjective needs. By definition, they vary, and there is a whole spectrum of them. And since it is also a question of circumstantial context, and by definition, this context also greatly vary. And therefore, ultimately, one cannot draw absolute boundaries in this respect because we are here speaking of relative determinations. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be very happy to answer questions or responses if you have some. I hope I will be able to hear you. Otherwise, maybe we can use the so-called chat function. Thank you.
Patrick, we're going to, can you hear me, Patrick? This is Brad Malkowski. We're going to go right to Carol Zaleski's presentation, and then after that, we can field questions that will be directed to either you or to her, okay?
Very good, thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we'll let Carol take over. Carol Zaleski, thank you.
Thanks for the very, very kind introduction and for your invitation. And I'm going to be speaking about William James, the guy that Alfred North Whitehead called the adorable genius. Title of my talk is An Arch Built Only on One Side, the Unfinished Perennialism of William James. I'm hoping you can hear me okay. All right, great. James was, if this isn't a kind of old-fashioned way to talk, I would say that James, the philosopher, psychologist who lived from 1842 to 1910 is quintessentially American in his democratic, pluralistic individualism, in his fascination with great awakenings, in his practical, experimental, therapeutic orientation, in his do-it-yourself metaphysics, in his frank, high-spirited prose. And yet he gave us, in his 1902 Varieties of Religious Experience, a spiritual classic that has had worldwide influence, and I think has timeless, or you might say perennial value, if not perennialist. Some of you perhaps will think of William James as an obvious choice for a conference on perennialism, especially if you think of what he says about mysticism in that regard. Others, perhaps more of you might think, as did René Guénon, that William James is the epitome of the anti-perennialist modernist. And the interesting thing about James is that both of these impulses are at work in him at once, or in alternation perhaps. And this reflects a larger fact about him. He regarded his philosophy, his moral life, and the universe as a whole as an unfinished project. The future was important to him, perhaps more than the past. I'm convinced that James's unfinished project, I'm convinced that it's mercifully unfinished, actually, and that it has something of value to communicate to us. 2 years after he published the Varieties of Religious Experience, James filled out a questionnaire that was circulated by a student of his, the psychologist James Pratt. One of the questions on it, I mean, the whole thing is fascinating, actually, but one of the really interesting questions is, do you believe in personal immortality? And James's answer is, never keenly, but more strongly as I grow older. And to the question, if so, why? And James says, because I'm just getting fit to live. Just getting fit to live is a very Jamesian thing to say. fitness with its Darwinian associations was a constant preoccupation for him. He actually had some quarrels with a former student, Teddy Roosevelt, over the idea of the strenuous life, what that should mean. He interpreted it more in a moral sense rather than military. But anyway, he was obsessed with fitness. And at the same time, he struggled, and perhaps for this reason, he struggled with episodes of crushing unfitness, which sent him on fruitless excursions to unorthodox healers and therapeutic baths. And at his lowest points, he considered suicide. But there were also times of exuberant well-being. All of this is actually quite relevant to what I want to say about his view of religion, so we'll get there. Anyway, there were also times of exuberant well-being. Hiking in his beloved Adirondacks could restore him. His experience of the second wind that supervenes upon exhaustion convinced him that on the far side of discouragement and fatigue, one finds vast reserves of mental, physical, and moral energy to tap into. But why does James say he's just getting fit to live? When he filled out Pratt's questionnaire, he was already suffering from the heart problem that would kill him 6 years hence. He was just getting rolling on his philosophical magnum opus, and he sensed that time was running out. He had introduced the world to his version of pragmatism. Let me give you a quick summary of all his lines of thought. Pragmatism, pragmatic in that it tests ideas by their conceivable practical effects. His radical empiricism, radical in that it counts as empirical whatever goes on, rather than reducing experience to sensation. His metaphysics of pure experience, a position later called neutral monism, according to which the flux of experience is variously taken as mental or material, and his pluralism, according to which reality is many-sided and still in the making. So there were all these lines of thought going on in James's mind, but they weren't unified. So his system, he said, was like an arch built only on one side, which is titled my talk. It's very poignant to see an inscription on there's this envelope, which is in the collection at Houghton Library at Harvard, an envelope in which he kept the manuscript for his final work. And if you look at the inscription on it, it says, "My unfinished book." I'm going to actually screen share for a moment and show you that and a couple other images. That's the Pratt questionnaire that I was quoting from. We can't explore it all, unfortunately, but it's pretty cool just to look at it. And here's James being fit and full of vigor and life, his favorite thing, and hiking in the Adirondacks with some friends. And here's the envelope I was just speaking of, my unfinished book. So morally, James saw himself as an unfinished project. What a waste it would be, he thought, if the moral strivings of human beings were going to end with the death of all our kind and the heat death of the universe itself. While we can't be certain that the cosmos is friendly to our deepest concerns, it would be fitting, in another sense of the word fit, that is the scholastic sense, convenientia, it would be fitting if there were more to the story than this bleak finality. And this sense of fittingness, which is just, it's not about certainty, but a sense of what would be fitting, as much as his celebrated studies of paranormal phenomena and nitrous oxide revelations kept James open to the possibility of transcendence. And I think this is important, having characterized him as kind of quintessentially American. I think this is where he speaks to our culture in ways that are unfinished, but promising. James was educated according to the deschooling convictions of his father, Henry Sr., who was an eccentric utopian socialist mystic, as the family moved back and forth across the Atlantic. Discouraged from pursuing a conventional career, James hopped, skipped from art to medicine to anatomy. He spent a year collecting fish specimens in the Amazon with the anti-Darwinian naturalist Louis Agassiz, and he came away from that with his eyes damaged by smallpox, a firm conviction that Darwin was actually right, and early symptoms of the malaise that would soon overtake him, and that is actually the key to his understanding of religion. He returned to medical school. He became an expert at dissection, but he realized that a medical career didn't suit him. Facing this impasse, plagued by back pain, gastritis, vision troubles, all kinds of maladies, James became depressed to the point that he said thoughts of the pistol, the dagger, and the bowl possessed him. In the early 1870s, we nearly lost William James. Soon after his 28th birthday, he took an excessive dose of chloral hydrate just for the fun of it, he told his brother, Henry the novelist. In February, as their beloved cousin Minnie Temple lay dying of tuberculosis, he wrote in his diary, "Today, I about touched bottom." And on March 9th of that year, he recorded her death, followed by this reflection. I'm going to screen share again, just for a second. Oh, that's James with his eyes damaged by smallpox, not just trying to look cool. This is a self-portrait where you can see that he had some gifts as an artist. It expresses his depression. And this is the recording of the death of his beloved cousin Minnie Temple. And this is what he wrote in his diary. I'm just going to quote a bit from it. "By that big part of me that's in the tomb with you, may I realize and believe in the immediacy of death. Minnie, your death makes me feel the nothingness of all our egotistical fury. Use your death or your life. It's all one meaning. Tat twam asi. Tat twam asi." Here we see the Mahavakya, the great saying from the Chandogya Upanishad, that art thou, you are that, you are like that, however you translate it, to which Professor Ramachan referred yesterday. Unfortunately, the place that James found this saying was probably not directly from the Chandogya Upanishad, but he found it in Schopenhauer, which means he found it overlaid with, imbued with an exaggerated and idiosyncratic pessimism. And it was in this distorted form that the saying came back to James and kind of haunted him while following an encounter with a catatonic patient. He wrote about it in these words: "That shape am I. Nothing that I possess can defend me against that fate if the hour for it should strike for me as it struck for him." So this depression and the suicidal ideation was combined with James's conviction that science, the science to which he was devoted, compels us to view our actions as nothing but the dull rattling off of a chain that was forged innumerable ages ago, quoting James there. He needed a new philosophy of freedom, or he would kill himself. Help came from the French philosopher Charles Renouvier, who defined free will as the sustaining of a thought because I choose to, when I might have other thoughts, a simple reframing of the idea. And James wrote in his diary, "My first act of free will shall be to believe in free will." Here was a case, James said, where faith created its own verification. It energized him to act freely and thereby to become ever more fit to live. And so he did. He began work on the principles of psychology, a 1,400-page masterpiece, probing the phenomena of sensation, perception, emotion, attachment, attention, habit, and will, and providing an account of the stream of consciousness, which has endeared him to Buddhists and to literary modernists alike. He joined the Metaphysical Club. He began giving popular talks with titles like "Is Life Worth Living?" and most famous of all, "The Will to Believe," in which he argued that we have an epistemic right to consult our deepest longings on vital questions that can't be decided objectively. So now in his Gifford Lectures on Natural Religion, which he delivered in Edinburgh and were published in 1902 under the title, The Varieties of Religious Experience, America's Religious Classic, James extended this epistemic right beyond propositional attitudes to the vast, perhaps chaotic realm of religious experience. The Varieties offered a sympathetic yet naturalistic interpretation of conversion, mystical states of consciousness, saintly affections, prayer. James's admirers praised him for his robust defense of religious experience and its life-giving power. His detractors criticized him for his emphasis on private, eccentric, and extreme mental states. But The Varieties was itself an unfinished work. James had planned a second volume, which would draw out his metaphysical conclusions. But the descriptive task took over, and he combed world literature for material. This wouldn't pass muster for scientific psychology today, but that's actually a strength because he gives us great stories. So we meet Augustine, Whitman, Tolstoy, Al-Ghazali, St. Teresa, Ramakrishna in The Varieties. We meet spiritualists, recovering alcoholics, acolytes of New Thought. He asked his friends, have you had a religious experience? Personal religious experience at first hand is his sole interest. Religious experience as an acute fever rather than a dull ache, I quote. So as a result, James leaves out a great deal, thereby scandalizing academics of a historicist or constructivist bent, while at the same time worrying traditionalists for his obvious neglect of tradition. But I maintain that we should not fault James for what he leaves out, only for what he rules out. And this is where the unfinished character of his work is actually helpful. In focusing on personal religious experience, James rediscovers what the traditional doctors of souls, from Patanjali of the Yoga Sutras to Jonathan Edwards of the Great Awakening, have understood all along, which is namely that the veridicality of a religious experience is best judged by its fruits for life, expression that James gets from Jonathan Edwards and from the Bible, but uses it as a pragmatic test. So, for example, does the vision of a Carmelite nun or a tantric sadhaka lead to sane moral conduct? Does it encourage her receptivity to spiritual counsel, harmonize with her pre-existing stock of beliefs, build up rather than tear down her community? These are the kind of considerations that James calls fruits for life tests or pragmatic tests. And what James calls a pragmatic test, the great religious traditions have always understood as the art of discernment. So there's a connection. Also, James offers a naturalistic account of conversion experience that comports well with many traditional accounts, a conviction of sin or wrongness leading to agonizing inward division, a moment when the ego despairs of its powers and surrenders, an inrush of grace, a sense of being illumined, awakened, forgiven, reborn, set free, a state of assurance, as he calls it in an evangelical language, so powerful that it changes the face of the outer world. James can describe this process with reference to psychological models, or he can describe it in traditional language. And one is so taken, or at least this one is, so taken with the personal testimonies he relates and with his own luminous prose that one hardly notices when he shifts from one vocabulary to the next. This characteristic of the Varieties accounts for its signal role in the creation of Alcoholics Anonymous. I can say more about that if you want later. So James tells us that beyond our ordinary consciousness is a farther region, which he calls by various names: subliminal consciousness, subconscious, the extramarginal or the wider self. Into this region are deposited impressions, ideas, motivations that we have forgotten, or lost interest in, or even rejected. And here they undergo a continuous growth, or what we call subconscious incubation. Under pressure, the thin walls of our ordinary consciousness may be breached, and the forgotten or rejected ideas may burst in, fully formed, to create a new center around which our identity rearranges itself. So that's his naturalistic psychological model for conversion, or transformative personal experience. James doesn't depend on Freud for this analysis, but it's an idea that has its roots in the Romantic tradition, the early experiments of Pierre Janet, and the findings of psychical research, what we call parapsychology now. In a talk on what psychical research has accomplished, James reports that his own study of hallucinations has convinced him that we all have potentially a subliminal self, which may make at any time irruption into our ordinary lives. In its lowest phases, it is only the depository of our forgotten memories. In its highest, we don't know what it is at all. But James actually did have a theory about its highest phases. Near the end of the varieties, he says, the further limits of our being plunge, it seems to me, into an altogether other dimension of existence from the sensible and merely understandable world. So James thinks if there is a God, God might act on us through the subconscious, thereby preserving our autonomy, which is a life or death question for James, free will, preserving our autonomy and our sanity against the shattering effect of an unveiled theophany. Remember how Arjuna has to ask Krishna to go back to that exoteric form that he can handle. That revelations from beyond should come mixed with ordinary and even pathological psychic content is not surprising for James. For in that region, as he says, seraph and snake abide side by side. So when he turns to mysticism, James is up to a lot of different things there. And it's in his treatment of mysticism that he's sometimes called perennialist, and usually in a pejorative sense. But one of the things he's trying to do is make the subject of mystical experience humanly familiar. So on the one hand, he likes to look at extreme and intense kind of examples of religious experience. On the other hand, he wants to show that we're all kind of on the spectrum. There's a continuum. If you've ever found a deeper significance in a sound or a cast of light or a word, if you've ever had that weird deja vu sensation, you're already on the mysticism spectrum, James says. James himself, of course, was no mystic, but he did say that he found in himself a mystical germ, which allowed him to recognize what the mystics are talking about. And what the mystics report, James tells us, is a transcendent encounter, analogous to sense experience in its immediacy and recognizable by 4 marks. And these 4 marks are repeated throughout a lot of literature on mysticism, sometimes even plagiarized, as if they were just kind of obvious. Here are the 4 marks that James offers for mystical experience: ineffability, noetic quality, transiency, and passivity. I'd love to talk about all of those notes, but I'm just going to mention transiency. Any mystical experience which remains merely interruptive would fail James's fruits for life test. By the same token, or maybe I should say conversely, a mystical experience, even if it's triggered by nitrous oxide or sleep deprivation or something like that, if it can be assimilated to the whole pattern, the gestalt of one's life and thought, that gives it a certain staying power and a claim to validity. But what follows from that, and this is something James doesn't develop, is that without a fully realized tradition to sustain and correct it, a mystical peak experience is liable to die on the vine and not to have that kind of truth-bearing power. Here's James waxing most perennialist. He says, in mystic states, we both become one with the absolute, and we become aware of our oneness. This is the everlasting and triumphant mystical tradition, I'm still quoting James, hardly altered by differences of clime or creed. In Hinduism, in Neoplatonism, in Sufism, in Christian mysticism, in Whitmanism, James says we find the same recurring note, so that there is about mystical utterances an eternal unanimity, which ought to make a critic stop and think, and which brings it about that the mystical classics have, as has been said, neither birthday nor native land. So the implication here is that mystical states are typically unitive states, directly experienced, tasted, as it were, in this unmediated way, without the mediation of words or concepts. And that as such, because they have this unitive aspect, they encourage a monistic interpretation or doctrine. Under the influence of nitrous oxide, James briefly had just such a vision of unmediated oneness. He said it was the only time he understood Hegel. And the felt immediacy of that experience was intense. But when the intoxication wore off, the monistic theory evaporated with it. Not because it had been triggered by nitrous oxide, that's okay for James, but because he couldn't harmonize it with his existing stock of beliefs. And then on closer inspection, this is sometimes overlooked in James's treatment of mysticism, James decides that mystical testimonies aren't so unanimous. They're varied, too varied to carry a whole lot of epistemic weight or to have authority. The only conclusion James says is forced upon him by his study of mysticism is that our normal, I'm quoting, our normal waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness, whilst all about it, parted from it by the flimsiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. Mystical states, he says, open out the possibility of other orders of truth. Their existence, I quote, overthrows the pretension of non-mystical states to be the sole and ultimate dictators of what we may believe. So this is the odd thing here. To appreciate such experiences in their diversity is to become a better pluralist for James, is to become more adept at seeing through other eyes than our own. And this I see as the great humanizing power of religious studies, generally, even academic religious studies, has this effect that we get to try to see what the world looks like through the eyes of adherents. And this is James's famous empathy at work. There are times when James's empathy fails him. Above all, when it comes to traditional Catholic practices, which, as he likes to say, quote, make us rub our Protestant eyes. He admires energetic saints like Teresa and Ignatius, but he draws the line at the ecstasies of Margaret Mary Alacoque. He thinks John Henry Newman's conversion to Catholicism was, in effect, an affair of smells and bells. But once we see such prejudices in James, we may want to press him further in the name of tradition. So we may ask, what can the varieties tell us about the intellectual practices that characterize fully realized religious cultures? Practices like memorization and recitation, commentary layered upon commentary, stylized scholastic debate. These are perennial characteristics of religious cultures. How about the fruits for life of Daf Yomi, the 7.5-year cycle of daily reading of the Babylonian Talmud? A finished varieties would explore the ways in which religious experience is the fruit and flower of such practices. But I maintain that nothing in James's descriptive account precludes such a fuller exploration. And actually his study of habit in the principles of psychology also reminds me of things we learn when we study methodical spiritual disciplines, about how habit constrains our freedom, but can also be harnessed in the service of freedom, or at least of a modest, creaturely kind of freedom, perfectible, we might add, by grace alone. By the same token, nothing in James's account precludes recognition of the ways in which supernatural claims, such as the primordiality of the Torah, the subject of Professor Brown's talk, or one might say the same about the Quran, reflect political circumstances. The best part is that James, despite a certain insouciance about history and politics, is actually showing us a way to recognize these forces, just as we may recognize the contribution of endorphins to a mystical state, and to give them their due without running roughshod over the self-understanding of religious folks. Something that Professor Cornell was stressing, our need to, and it's very dear to James, this idea that we need to respect the self-understanding of religious individuals and communities. More worrisome are the conclusions James sketches toward the end of the varieties. Here he advances his pragmatic theory of truth, truth being equivalent to what is good or expedient to believe. Bertrand Russell said that James's pragmatism was like a bath with hot water running in so slowly that you don't know when to scream. Actually, I think I do know when to scream when I read James. On the other hand, I take him at his word when he insists that he is a realist. He doesn't deny that there are realities outside the thinker. What he affirms is that reality presents itself to us as a famous saying from him, a blooming, buzzing confusion, which comes into focus by acts of selective attention directed by our interests, our habits of thought, and our capacity for love. This is a religious insight. I found it in many different spiritual traditions, that you see what you love. James's considered viewpoint is not skepticism, but fallibilism. And that's a posture of intellectual humility that I find myself admiring even when I disagree with his ultimate conclusions. Toward the end of the varieties, James ventures into speculative theology, and he's not very good at it. He starts by noting that for most people, the God of most people's religious experience is the guarantee of an ideal order that shall be permanently preserved. The world may indeed, as science assures us, someday burn up or freeze, but if it is part of his order, the old ideals are sure to be brought elsewhere to fruition, so that where God is, tragedy is only provisional and partial, and shipwreck and dissolution are not the absolutely final things. But that's what James says most religious people think. What does James himself think about God? James actually wavers between two rival and kind of half-baked conceptions. According to the conception he calls crass supernaturalism, God is a limited human being who collaborates with us, calling forth our best efforts to improve the world. So, evoking the moral strenuous life. According to the conception he calls pluralistic pantheism, we are co-conscious with a wider life, a continuum of cosmic consciousness into which our several minds plunge as into a mother sea. But on either of those views, it's hard to see how we get the guarantee of an ideal order that shall be permanently preserved. It could turn out that shipwreck and dissolution are the absolutely final things. To my mind, only the infinite, eternal God of the robust theistic traditions can provide the security we need. And this God falls outside of James's rough scheme. He leaves it out, at least. I don't think he totally rules it out. But anyway, so why do I still admire William James and commend him to this conference? Because he writes well, which is no small thing. Because he found a way to overcome the intellectual vetoes and inhibitions that prevent many of our contemporaries from taking religion seriously. Because he acknowledges the myriad biological, social, and cultural forces that shape religious experience. He shows us how to do that but he has too much respect for the self-understanding of religious people to fall into the constructivist camp. And because he takes a mostly hands-off approach to the distinctive supernatural claims of the world's religions, not seeking to unite them from above. And this strikes me as a wholesome corrective to the versions of perennialism, which, as Professor Cornell suggested, seek to establish supermagisteria of their own. Speaking from my own experience, it was James's non-dogmatic pluralism that made me think I could understand something of the world's religions from within, and that led me to realize that religion is most interesting and life-giving in its traditional, dogmatic, fully realized forms. As a child of secularism, I walked through James's wide open door into the very church James himself was least capable of understanding. Yet having passed through that door, I don't claim to understand fully what God is doing with religions other than my own. What I can do is discover wonderful sympathies, correspondences, analogs across traditions and cultures. Analogs, let's say, to Vedic sacrifice, to Christian purgatory, to Buddhist merit transfer, and so on. What I can't do is make these analogs converge into one system. What I can do is cherish the moral, spiritual, and civilizational fruits of other traditions. What I can't do is unite them from above. I can recognize in every major religion the awareness that we did not make ourselves. And from this awareness comes an instinct for repentance and an ethic and aesthetics of adoration, a creature consciousness, if you will, on the basis of which, in a world that has lost its religious bearings, we can make common cause even when we fail to find common ground. And so I continue to appreciate James's non-reductionist naturalism and to love James for his unfinished wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you for your presentations. Very stimulating, both of them. We have about 10 minutes. We can even go a few minutes longer to field questions. Either, I'm not sure if we can do it here in the room. We can do it. We can do it here in the room, or maybe people can also, through their Zoom connection, either through chatting, or I don't know if we can get a direct connection. Yeah, either one. You can also ask your questions. But I do ask this, is that all of your questions should be formulated precisely and succinctly. We have to leave opportunity for many different voices to speak. So please do not formulate your question in the guise of a lecture or the other way around, okay?
Turn it on. Sorry.
A question for Dr. Laude. Thank you for your enlightening talk. I would just ask if you could perhaps expand a little on the distinctions between the nomian, antinomian, and then the anomian, and what might be some of the reasons why certain religious figures might be antinomian or anomian, seemingly against the nomian.
Thank you for your question. When I made this distinction between anomian and antinomian, what I had in mind was very simple, actually. In antinomian, to me at least, there is a nuance of being against the law, or not abiding by the law, but also basically opposing the law in some sense. Whereas the anomian to me suggests simply the fact that the esoteric, in some transcends the law in a certain sense, and therefore is independent from it without being opposed to it. So that's all I had in mind, really. Of course, the situation is very complex, as you know, especially in traditions like Islam. There are types of Sufism which are perfectly Nomian, so to speak, and Sharaite. There are others which take more distance from the strict adherence to the law. There is a whole spectrum of possibilities. And so therefore the question is complex, and that's the reason why in the end I insisted on the relativity, so to speak, of needs and context. One side doesn't fit all, so to speak. And yes, so that's all I meant by this distinction, basically.
A question for Professor Zaleski. I was very, your account reminded me very much of, Charles Taylor's work kind of on the immanent frame, and where, he distinguishes between sort of, whether one is closed. And from his perspective, we all inhabit the immanent frame, and I'm not sure whether you would contest that. He believes it's the case that all people, regardless of whether they're practicing a traditional religion or what it may be, they're within this immanent frame, but it's rather whether, we're truly open to the transcendent or closed. And so I'm curious if you see any connections with his work in that regard.
Sorry for the delay. I wasn't able to unmute myself. Only the host can permit me to unmute myself. Maybe Professor Laude had that problem too. Anyway, yeah, I suppose I do see connections. I'm really not that well versed. I know this is ridiculous, but I'm not that well versed in Charles Taylor's thought. I kind of skidded past it, read his earlier work. So yeah, I hear the immanent frame all the time. But so, in terms, I don't know about James, but I suppose what attracts me to thinkers like this that do this kind of perennialism from below is that they leave open the many different forms that this instinct for transcendence could take. And it's not that I think of, I'm not being like Schleiermacher or something like that. It's not that I think that it isn't God's initiative. I think the instinct we have for transcendence is a divine gift, and there's a divine initiative involved in every movement towards that. But I don't know if that's really close to what you were asking about. So that's why I've fallen silent right now.
Oh no, sorry. I just mean that in a sense. I mean, from his perspective, he has this perception that academia inhabits a closed state, which is that there's no transcendent. We can talk about it, we can study it in great detail, but at the end of the day, we're just the secular account is the true one, and sort of it kind of imposes its logic on us, and it's incontestable, right? Whereas he'd want to say, really, whether you're inhabiting a secular perspective, right? And James could be kind of, an appreciative, at the end of the day, basically secular person in that sense. It's sort of like, I think there's a distinction between, say, a documentary about a saint, where it's sort of like, well, we don't necessarily, know what's going on there, but in a sense, we're not reducing it, right, to kind of something that is sort of epistemically available to anybody who's sort of observing. There's something there, and we sort of, apophatically, we maintain an apophatic reserve in kind of pronouncing finally on what's going on there. And I see an affinity there. And the same thing can be true from the, sort of religious adherence side, right? There can be a dogmatic closedness that sort of, we know that this is true and we pronounce it, and it's just kind of, that's the end of the story. But on the other hand, it's possible to inhabit that maybe in a more open way. I was just clarifying just kind of the, the context of the mark. But anyway, I don't know if you have any further reflections, but if not, the floor to anyone else who has a question.
Yeah, I think you just said that beautifully. So we can talk about being undogmatic secularists or undogmatic perennialists, but either way, unless we see the beauty of dogma where it lives, we're missing something. So where it lives in its different religious traditions.
Thank you for both of your lectures. I thought they were really interesting and beautiful. And I have actually a rather simple question for Professor Laude. In the beginning, I was sort of raising the question of what it might be that makes perennialism and Sufism so closely intertwined, or why perennialists became Sufis or Sufis became perennialists. And there was something in what you said about Advaita Vedanta not being esoteric, because everything about Advaita is non-dual, and therefore there's no distinction between esotericism and exotericism. And I wonder if you have any ideas about that connection between Sufism and perennialism, and why it is that there seems to be such a intimate relationship between those two, whereas, of course, there are mystical and apophatic traditions in every religion. I just wonder if you have any ideas about that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your question. It's well, one way to approach it is simply by going back, for example, to what Guénon wrote about the world of Sufism being a kind of middle way between the world of the Christian West and that of the Indic traditions, or even Asian traditions in general. Between Xuan also refers to the Sufism as being a kind of middle way between the world of the Bible and the world of the Upanishad, if you wish. So I think in that sense, Islam, and particularly, of course, spiritual Islam and mystical Islam, is in an ideal situation, religiously and culturally, being at the convergence, so to speak, of two very different worlds. And I think another reason why there is a clear affinity between esotericism as defined by Guénon and Xuan and the world of Sufism is that in the world of Sufism you have a balance, in a sense, between the emphasis on the absolute truth, the hakika, the essence itself, and at the same time the multiplicity of the forms connected to the tradition and to the Sharia that integrate the person and provide a support and symbolic support for spiritual realization. That's another possible connection. There would be others, no doubt, but that's two I can think of at this stage. Yes, thank you.
Would it be also a possibility, the kind of contrast between the clarity of the law and then the experience that you call antinomian, or beyond the law?
Yes, in a way, and I think Guénon, when he started speaking in terms of esotericism, very often actually his references are Islamic, because as you mentioned, if you consider Advaita Vedanta, which is one of the three main sources of inspiration for Guénon, you have basically Advaita Vedanta, you have Taoism, and you have, to a lesser extent, actually Sufism. In the two first cases, we are in the domain of absolute esotericism in Jungian terms. It is only in the case of Sufism that you have this complementarity between what Guénon calls the exoteric and the esoteric, and that the complementarity is quite clear. In both other cases, it's a very different set of different circumstances and different structure for the tradition.
Perish Leuke, also to Professor Laude. Just a quick remark on the things you just said. I really have difficulties to follow you in that regard, because when we look at Shankara and Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, we clearly have these two levels there as well. I mean, he speaks about Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman, and he has this whole teaching of two truths, or Satyadvaya, which could also be translated as two realities. So it is not missing at all in Advaita Vedanta. So could you please explain? Because I could not follow what you were saying.
Oh, I totally agree with you that there is in Shankara's Vedanta, you have two levels. You have the pedagogical level, which is for everybody, so to speak, and you have the actual metaphysical, non-dual understanding of the scriptures. But the difference here is that the literal meaning of the scripture, the literal understanding of the scripture, doesn't form a kind of complement to an esoteric half, so to speak. It is simply a propaedeutic that is rendered necessary by the fact that most practitioners are not from the outset able to enter, so to speak, into non-duality. So even though I follow you in the sense that that is true, two different levels of understanding of the scriptures and the traditions, we are in a situation which is altogether different from that, let's say, of Islam, where the Sharia and the Tariqah, or Sharia and the Haqiqah, are complementary, so to speak, and definitive and permanent. Whereas the external understanding of the Upanishad is only, as you said, provisional.
Yeah, but are you not neglecting then this broad tradition of the Dharma Shastras in India, this whole legal tradition, which is also a religious tradition and tied back to the more doctrinal level or the Upanishadic level, or whatever tradition they stand? And as I read Shankara, he never ever opposed this. He explicitly says in several in places that it's not his intention to make any changes at this level of relative or conventional truth.
I absolutely agree with you. Absolutely. Is precisely because he considers the two levels. There is the social level, the Dharma Shastra, the Varna system, which is the framework within which non-dual spirituality may grow. So I do not want to imply at all that Shankara is a kind of religious revolutionary. Not at all. He places each reality on its own level without any confusion of the planes. So
but if you admit
but yes, please.
If you admit
Yes.
that, then I don't understand your answer to Catherine Cornell's question, because as I understood you, as I heard you, your answer was that people like Guénon and others turn to Sufism because there they find these two levels, while these two levels were apparently absent in Vedanta, which they are not, as you just admitted.
No, they are not absent, but they do not constitute a path, so to speak, having two complementary halves, you see. And this is shown, for example, by the institution of the sannyasin. The sannyasin does not reject, let's say, the caste system, or doesn't reject the tradition, but still personally and spiritually, the sannyasine is free from the limitations of the tradition, is a kind of outcast, spiritual outcast. So, so you see, that's what I meant. There's a distinction to make here, I think. And the tradition, the Indian tradition, is a complex tradition. It's an array of paths rather than a religion in the sense of Christianity, of Islam. It's not a religion. It doesn't have any single principle of unity.
Those are pretty long comments. That would take a long time.
See if someone wants to ask a question.
I think.
Yeah. We have time for one or two more brief oral questions, not written ones, because we're very limited by time. So we're open to doing that, but not any lengthy contributions, either orally or in written. But we especially would value an oral contribution of some kind, but keeping it short before we draw this session to a close. I think now the silence tells us that I think we've drawn this session to a close. It's been very, very stimulating to all of us, I think, to me in particular, for reasons I won't go into. And I really am grateful for the contributions of these two speakers today. I think we offer them we owe them a hearty thank you through applause, any way you want. So thank you so much.